world, and welcome to another episode of the South African Spice Podcast. Today we dig into the second course of our conversation with Priyanka, where we learn more about her love for all things food. Be sure to listen to part 1 of this conversation if you haven't done so yet, as we pick up where we left off in part 1. So Priyanka, I'm very interested to know from you, what was the first dish you ever made?
So, funny enough, it was not curry. It was noodles. I was 9 years old when I first started cooking. I started making noodles. I really have a passion for Asian food, a passion for eating it and cooking it, and exploring it. And my mom's uncle would come and visit us prior to him moving in with us. He just retired off the ship, had lots of free time on his hands, and every weekend or second weekend he would come and spend an entire Sunday afternoon, and my mom would make this entire spread for him of Western food. And I often would be there and I would make noodles. Initially it was just the 2-minute noodles, and then she started making stir fries and I'd watch her, and then I started to recreate that. And I think maybe that's the reason why Asian food is so near and dear to my heart. And of course, at the time, my dad, most Friday nights would get takeout. He would buy me Chinese food. So I know it's probably not the answer you're looking for, but it definitely has also molded my passion for food from a different perspective, because, I often attribute a lot of my tastes and my recipes to my family, but a lot of it also does come from traveling. Mm-hmm. And the people in my life who have traveled and have exposed me to travel. So I would say that Asian food is something that my husband and I today, even thankfully, I found a man who loves Asian food as much as me, because some people don't like Asian food. But, Asian food is what I started experimenting with.
That's crazy. Who doesn't like Asian food? What's wrong with them?
I know, right?
But how important is it to also have your partner enjoy the same food as you? Because I can imagine it would be incredibly difficult if your life was any different.
I think it's really important. I know when you speak to people, some people say, my partner is vegetarian, or I know my mom's cousins, the one twin, actually the both twins are vegetarian, and the one twin has a wife and 2 kids who eats meat. And then the other twin has a daughter who's also vegetarian, and a son and a daughter who eats meat. I think if you have a good partnership and an understanding, it's okay, because some people genuinely support each other. Where if you are somebody who, it's just 2 of you living together, I'm thinking now out aloud, with my husband and I, if he said tomorrow he had to become vegetarian, or if he had to give up something, I don't really think it would be an issue for me particularly, because I love food and I love to create and I get inspired by it, and I wouldn't mind going the extra mile for him. But like I said, if you have an understanding, I think it's fine. Sometimes there's certain things that my husband doesn't really like that I like. He, as much as he doesn't really like seafood, it doesn't really agree to him. So for me, most of the time I shy away from eating prawns, when we go to a restaurant, because we often order 2 meals and we'd share, we'd exchange, midway. So I don't order prawns. But I think once again, it is a mutual understanding. It is a relationship that you're in, and you have to be able to compromise. But if we are eating out with a lot of other people, I'm every man for themselves. I'm gonna have my prawns now. But in most cases, I'm very compromising, and I think it's really important to be compromising in a relationship, especially when it comes to food, because food is a sense of nourishment, and it shouldn't be a burden to people who are, living in one household.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree. In my instance, my husband is very adventurous with food. And he likes to also create, and he likes to eat a lot of things that I don't necessarily like to eat. He's introduced me to blue cheese and anchovies and all these things that I really shied away from. And I like it, but I think when we find things that we both really enjoy, it's such a unique experience to share that. And even to travel and to try new things together is also such a good experience.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So my husband comes from a very conservative family. There's a few dishes that he has told me that was quite predominant in his upbringing. And it's only in the last recent years that my mother-in-law has started exploring and experimenting with her dishes. I know for a fact that we've been together now for 15 years, and in those 15 years, the first time he ever tried sushi was with me. That being said, we've traveled quite a bit as well, and so with regards to the traveling, he's much, much more open-minded when it comes to food and different cuisines. Also, he has never been exposed to Asian food. I think maybe he probably had like chow mein once before being in a relationship with me, but we both love food now. So I would classify him as a foodie. He loves experiencing new flavors. He loves experimenting. He's very open to the idea. If I say I want to make something that's completely new, when we do travel or when we are going to a new place for the very first time, he is open to having a look at what, the cuisine is about. I would say he is adventurous compared to how he used to be. And like you said, it's such a beautiful thing when you are a couple and you get to experience new things for the first time together. Because I believe that, we're talking about food and it sounds so crazy, but I believe that that is something that can definitely elevate your relationship. As much as I'm a foodie, there's a lot of things that I've never tried, and we do these things together, and it's just so beautiful.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I know that he is your biggest supporter. Now, when you try these new dishes, is he a good critic or does he just say things to make you happy?
No, my husband is very forthright. He is somebody who is going to tell you how something is, even if there's like a lot of people around, he will be absolutely honest about his opinion. You are going to get everything from him, like with no filter. I always say to people, especially if they're meeting him for the first time, he doesn't have a filter. But most of the time, thankfully, and I don't mean to sound boastful, majority of the time, he hasn't really complained about much. There has been a couple times where he has been like, no, this is not for us, or I don't like this, or, it's not my cup of tea, and I do appreciate that. And, that's the thing, like you said, he's my biggest supporter. I wouldn't want somebody to just tell me something is nice when it's not nice, because a lot of my recipes that I do share on my social media pages, especially if it's something that is new, often has measurements that are attached to it. So if there's like less salt, or if there's, I don't know, something's just a bit off, or if it's not balanced, he's there to kind of keep me aligned. So sometimes you need that, not just like when it comes to food, but in life in general. You need somebody who's going to keep you accountable and who's going to give you like an honest review and an honest opinion.
Absolutely agree. And who better for that person to be than your partner?
Of course.
So you guys travel a lot and you've explored, with a lot of food when you travel. But is there anything that you miss in terms of South African food when you do travel?
Yeah, like when I go overseas, I'm like most people, very excited. Bags are packed. Can't wait to get on the plane. Can't wait to eat the plane food. Not really, but you know what I mean. Just explore and travel, and you're looking forward to this vacation. But I don't want to sound like, I do want to admit though, like if we go for a long time, I guess I could say we kind of like our parents, where we do levitate towards an Indian restaurant somewhere around the world. It's not always, but it's home, like no matter where you go, you miss those spices, you miss those flavors, you miss that heat of the food that you eat, even if it's not a curry. Like you're so used to cooking with certain spices or in a certain way that you do miss it. And if there is one thing, if I'm being particularly honest, the first thing that I make when I come home is a Durban style lamb curry. Like that is a must. That just hits home differently after you shower. The meat's defrosted. It's going into my Instant Pot because it takes 30 minutes to make. And the potatoes are melting potatoes. And it's just a sense of home instantly as soon as we arrive.
I agree. It's actually the meal I make for anybody who comes to visit us for South Africa. For some reason, that's what I make. They all come home to.
Sure, it's very comforting.
It's comforting for me to make that for them. I don't know how they feel. And still talking about traveling, I do want to touch on your trip to India. So I know that you've traveled to India and you've obviously eaten food that's made in India. What do you find between the Indian food and the South African Indian food to be, both the similarities and the differences between what we make or how we make it?
So I feel like I personally feel that South African Indian food is completely unique. You will never eat a curry anywhere in the world other than if it's made by a South African expat, like what you would find in South Africa. And I'm not speaking in any disrespect to any, curry that's made out there. I say this with all due respect that our ancestors came from India with very little that they had access to. Maybe some of them, had access to certain spices that they might have brought along. But what they had access to here was very limited resources, and they had no choice but to find spices and make do with what they had access to and create different variations of what they knew they needed from home. And so that has translated as the years have gone by and has progressed, and we've been granted with all of these different flavors that what most people would probably think is an Indian curry, when in fact it is a developed curry with such a rich history that South African from India, that came from India, now live in South Africa, has made their own. So I do find the similarities in terms of, yes, we use the same ground spices, yes, we use the same whole spices, but if you were to do a blind test, taste test, you would never say that it's the same curries, because the way it's made, the amount of spices that's used, the spices that are actually made is completely different. But you asked in terms of similarities. South Africans use a lot of the same spices. Like, you could go to India and you know for a fact if you had to cook a South African Durban curry in India, it would probably be your South African curry in India using their spices. Might not taste exactly the same, but it is going to be similar. You're still going to get those hints of, chili. You're still going to get those hints of the garam masala and, the dhania jeera powder, and of course the whole spices. The Indian food is very different because they cook with a lot of cream, they cook with a lot of ghee, they cook with a lot of yogurt. Their spices are a lot more, prominent in their curries. I do feel like they also cook with a lot of texture, which is something that we don't have access to. Like, they cook a lot of tandoori dishes. Their gravies are a lot more smoother than ours are as well. Of course, a lamb curry or a chicken curry is very different. And I found that because I've been to India a couple times and I've eaten a lot of vegetables, because most of the times when we went to the ashram and we were fasting. The vegetable curries you spoke about, like sour herbs and dal, I have never tasted that in India. Maybe, it could be regionalized, like it could come from a specific village or a specific region, because I know that there's a lot of dishes that do come and do have rich history behind it. But in terms of like the vegetable dishes, I haven't tried a South African Indian vegetable curry anywhere in the world other than in South Africa. So yes, similar in terms of spices, but not similar in terms of execution and end result.
Yeah, no, definitely. I also find that when you talk to people, here in Europe or anywhere else where we travel, and they realize you're Indian, and it's automatically a thing like, oh, so you eat butter chicken every day in your house, not realizing that even when we were in South Africa, those are the things that we would ourselves go to the North Indian restaurants for to have instead of making it on our own, because the traditional Indian food we cook at home is so different to every Indian restaurant that's out there.
Yeah, I agree. And I still feel like today, being a millennial living in South Africa, fourth generation South African Indian, there still is a lack of knowledge of what South African Indian food is here in South Africa. You know, most people who are not Indian, who go out and they dine out at an Indian restaurant, they think that, they think that they can get that type of curry like in any Indian home, like as if, they were friends with somebody and they'd be like, oh, you have access to samosas, you have access to butter chicken, not realizing that the special foods or the special curries that we make is only special because we made those curries. Like the spices came from, past generations. You'll never be able to, in fact, there's this guy, when I created my account about a year ago, I think he moved to, if I'm not mistaken, Australia. And he's very much like you. He lives in a part of Australia where like the city is like a couple hours away. And my heart just went out to him. So he's white and he messaged me and he's like, "Hi Priyanka, how are you? I really miss a Durban curry. I have tasted curry here in Australia and it's just not the same." And I was like, wow, kudos to you. Like, like the penny dropped. And he was like, yeah, I've traveled near and far, and, finding your video online, he went on, and I've got a YouTube channel where the video is quite extensive of when to do certain things when braising a curry, when the meat goes in, when the spices go in, how to actually cook the curry, how much of tomatoes to put in. He went and studied that video, and he eventually found the spices, because there was a special Kashmiri masala that I buy. Obviously you can get it from most shops, but obviously the masalas and the spices overseas differ, because the method in making them is different, so the ultimate result would be different. And he just wasn't winning, and eventually I don't know if he made his own masala by grounding the Kashmiri chili, or he found the Kashmiri masala, but he eventually found it, and he was so thankful that he had access to a Durban curry.
It makes a big difference. It's, it's something else. But okay, so talking a lot about the South African Indian food, when we talk about like South African Indian food and trying to identify what's truly ours, I know a bunny chow usually comes up as one of those things. What else do you think is truly unique to being South African Indian foods?
So definitely biryani, Alicia. I think biryani is something that is completely unique to South Africa. Of course, there's biryani all over the world, but you'll never get a biryani like a Durban South African biryani. Like you said about the temple food, the lentils that are put in the biryani, the potatoes hit differently, the meat is cooked and prepared with the most amazing fragrant spices, the saffron that goes in, the way it's marinated with dhania and with mint and with the onions, very similar to how people in India make their biryani and other parts of the world. You could even compare it to a Pakistani biryani, completely different. Here we also have such a big community of Muslims, and the spice biryani that you get access to, that they make, their masala biryani, also you'll never get it anywhere in the world. It's what makes, I'm probably sure someone's going to be listening to this and they're going to be like, what's so nice about South African food that you are just boasting and boasting and boasting about it? Of course it's preferential, but the love that goes into it, the flavors that we have, that we've adapted for our climate, for our people, for our community, is completely different. I would also say that a crab curry, I know that in different parts of India, crab is cooked, but the way a crab curry is cooked, the way a fish curry is cooked, especially if you're making it that typical South Indian way with the pili water, with the tamarind, that's just completely different. I've never had fish curry or crab curry or prawns curry in that particular way. And then I know chicken curry does differ, because some people make like akni, or they put yogurt in their curry, and there's different variations of it. But a chicken curry and a lamb curry or mutton curry is very different. I've seen so many different videos of how people in India make their curries, and as lovely as it looks and as amazing as it tastes, because I've tasted it overseas, it's not the same as what you get here in South Africa. So in terms of defining South African Indian food, I think one has certainly got to try a biryani, chicken, veg, mutton. If you know somebody who can hook you up with a fish biryani, a good fish biryani, definitely try that out. A good crab curry, and make sure that it's spicy. You need to have pure white bread, fresh white bread with that. have a glass of Coke. You also have to try a prawn curry, proper fish curry, and of course, you cannot leave South Africa without having a bunny chow with either chicken or lamb. And how can I forget about offals? I'm not one to eat offals very often, but the only offals that I've been exposed to is tripe and trotters, and I have never seen that being cooked anywhere else other than here in South Africa. Not just only by South African Indians, but by South Africans. Like offals is something that is celebrated amongst many different heritage and heritages and cultures here in South Africa. So Trace's curry is one of my favorite curries, and if you are up to it, I think people should definitely give it a go. Not just the sugar beans, because I know that the sugar beans is very flavorful, and lots of people just eat the sugar beans, but not the Traces. It really is amazing.
I agree. It's also one of my favorites. And as you're mentioning all these things, I'm just salivating, but I'm also thinking about should I make a fish curry today because I managed to find like a tamarind paste.
Oh, nice.
So I don't use the proper pulley, but you know what? The paste works fine.
Yeah, it will work. I have some of that in my fridge currently as we're speaking. I've got both.
And I think, so I just got two more questions for you. And I think these are two very defining questions. So the first one is still very much related to food. And what I'd like to know from you as a foodie, as a South African Indian, how do you feel South African Indian food defines and unites us as South African Indians?
Well, everything that we've spoken about, is an attributing factor to that's this question, because South African food has such a rich history behind it. Like, as I mentioned, I don't think as a community we look back with gratitude of how far our people have come in today's society and what we now have access to. So I definitely would say that South African curries or the spices that we have access to is really important in our community. I mean, anywhere you go, and this is what I find so fascinating. We've never met before other than, on this podcast, and if I had to go and eat at a South African takeaway or at a Naidu's house or Governor's house or Singh's house or Maharaj's house, you are most likely going to get the same curry. It's like, most people say they have a recipe from their grandmother that has been passed down to them, and that recipe is like gold. But isn't it fascinating how you can go to different South African Indian homes and a mutton curry almost 9 out of 10 times, if not 10 out of 10 times, tastes the same?
Absolutely.
You can go to different temples and eat temple food, but the vegetable biryani is still as good.
Absolutely.
So I don't even think I know how to answer that question, because the food that we have access to as South Africans, especially South African Indians, has played such a major role in our community that, like I said, I don't think many of us understand or is grateful, should be grateful enough for, because it's stuff that we eat on a day-to-day basis that we just take for granted. It's indoctrinated in our families, and it's all we know.
Even the things we don't like, to be honest, because I grew up not liking tin fish. Like, I didn't like it when my mother made the tin fish. But as I got older, and now as I moved here, one of the things that people had to pack for me to bring was the cans of Lucky Star, because I needed to make tin fish chutney.
You see.
And then my final question for you, and this we'll use to, wrap up this wonderful conversation that we've had. Priyanka, what kind of South African Indian are you?
Oh, I think this is a really great question. I think being a South African Indian that is a little bit of a mixed masala, because my childhood has been impacted by my grandparents, both sides of my family. I am, Tamil at heart, Telugu at heart, now marrying into a Tamil/Hindi family, and having all of that has really played a role in who I am today. I think being a millennial especially, I think when you're growing up in South Africa, and I'm thinking about like when I was in school, and they'd often have these census and they'd ask you to pick up your hand if you were Indian or if you were Caucasian, and whichever bracket you fell into, I didn't really understand what it meant to be a South African Indian. But today, if somebody like yourself asking me this question really makes me someone who's completely proud to be a South African Indian, because when I look back at my grandparents and my great grandparents, and when I hear the stories about my granny's grandparents, it makes me realize how grateful I am to be here in South Africa. Because if you know the struggles that our forefathers had to endure to for us to get to where we are today, we are so blessed to be where we are. I don't think we were just talking about this over this past weekend, where life could have been so different for us, Alicia. We are modern millennials living in a different part of the world, and we still get to share our heritage and be true to ourselves, yet being so proud to be South African at the same time. Very rarely do people actually say, I'm from India, or my great grandparents are from India, and that's where the story ends. That's great, because you've moved, you're an expat. We have a whole rich history that's attached to our our family bloodline. And I think if one doesn't really understand how important what their forefathers had to endure and go through to be where we are today, I don't think most Gen Zs and future generations will even comprehend that. Like I said at the beginning of the podcast, the puzzle pieces are actually starting to disintegrate. And I still feel like there's a sense of hope for us to be able to put that together. But another generation, a generation past millennials, if your family has not indoctrinated you or spoken about the rich history and where we come from, I don't think many people would be able to say they know what it is like to be a true South African Indian. And I'm so grateful that my family has taken the time and the liberty to research, our forefathers. My uncle, who's involved in the Heritage Center, who's so passionate about letting the stories of our forefathers live on, amongst us in our communities today, which will shape our generation and our future, forever. Because, if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be able to be where we are today, let alone even have access to this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important. Storytelling and, those things, having that happen really will ensure that the stories live on. But also, like you said, we definitely are the last generation who has the ability to put things together, to fill in missing links wherever we can. And it's also really important as this generation to make sure that we are able to continue telling the stories and to keep everything we know alive by passing it on to, even if it's other people and not necessarily our own kids, but anybody who is interested in wanting to hear and know about it. I think it's really important that we do that.
Yeah, I think it's like you said, in school you often learn that history will repeat itself, and history is a huge part of who we are. And at some point you realize, like, when you were younger, like, why am I even learning this? Like, it's gonna have no value in my life. But you don't realize as you get older and as you develop, and the things that you look for is community, family. And I feel like if you are not somebody who is grateful to be here today, you wouldn't be able to pass that on to the next generation, because there's certain habits and rituals and customs that have been passed down to our parents, that have been passed down by our grandparents and their parents, and it literally is in us. Like, I'm pretty sure, completely off topic, how to cut green beans in a specific way,
Yes.
or the meaning of keeping your butter containers,
Yes.
or what to do when you pray, or to be covered when you go to a temple. All of those things have been filtered down by generations. We may not understand it when you're growing up, especially if there's someone that's younger that's listening to this. You may not understand it, but only when you reach a certain age and when you leave home do you appreciate and do you understand why it was said and why it was that. Even if there's no logic behind it, it's home. It's a sense of home.
Definitely. there's so many things I think that we can pass down to, next generations. I do worry though that where we are, people are going to stop doing certain things because they feel like, either they're changing their religion and they feel that these things are linked to that religion, but not understanding that there's a difference between what we do culturally, what we do religiously, what we do traditionally, just these things that we continue to pass down. And it even comes to like things you do when a baby comes to the house, or what you do for your birthday, how you cut the cake and you feed the person. And, these type of things, it is very unique to who we are. And I hope that this generation, our generation, continues doing these things and passes it down, because for as long as that continues, that is as long as our lineage and our customs will continue.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like a lot of millennials and baby boomers have done a great job, instilling good values and customs into future generations. I feel like a lot of millennials have acquired a lot of those customs, and with the knowledge that we have access to and with what we have access to, like with the internet, a lot of people do their own research. Yes, there's a handful of people who might not be interested or, wouldn't even bother filtering this type of stuff. But there are a lot of people like yourself who take it upon themselves to preserve the knowledge and, appreciate things that have happened. And I feel like as we get older, like I said, the generation that I'm in, the millennial generation, a lot of the people will appreciate the small little puzzle pieces and will be able to put it together. And you will always have that community. And I just hopefully, it translates generation to generation. And, we are able to always be indebted to, our history, our rich history that we have access to here in South Africa, that has shaped us and molded us, and, that has played such a huge vital role in not just, maybe you might say, not in our lives, but in our forefathers' lives, in our great grandparents' lives. Fortunately, it's translated into our grandparents' lives, and because of them, ultimately we are who we are because of our parents.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Sure. Thank you so much for having this conversation and allowing us to get to know you a bit better. I think this was great. There's so much about you I never would have known. And I'm so glad that you actually were open to sharing everything with us.
Well, thank you so much. I didn't really know how big this was until last week when we spoke. And, I've got a lot of time for people who want to preserve being truly proudly South African, especially if you're an expat. You don't have to be, South African Indian, but I mean, like, you've got to feel for expats because they're leaving a piece of home and they're trying to find a piece of home at the same time. But a day later, I spoke to my cousin who's been living in the United States of America for 9 years. And she just spoke to me and was telling me about how she resonates with my page and how I posted a video of my who her grandfather and my granny are siblings, and how she saw so much of his ways in that video just by seeing her, and how, she would kill to hear a South African accent, And I think this type of podcast, she asked for the link. She asked for all of your links, so she can have a sense of home. And I really hope that other people like her and other expats that are tuning in or, have access or stumble upon this really just shares it, because it'll always be a sense of home. It's always a sense of, sharing. That's what makes us so special as South Africans. It's our hearts.
Definitely. I think it's so deeply rooted in who we are in our South African culture that we just want to help. We want that sense of unity. And I find that it amplifies when we are out of South Africa. So I'm really happy to hear that, because that means it gives me such relief to know that I'm on the right path and that I'm not the only person who also feels as isolated being an expat out here. So
all the best to your community, and I hope that every podcast that you take on leaves people with a smile on their face, and they miss home a little less.
Thank you so much. I really do appreciate that. And thank you so much for creating the content that you do. And I know that if any of our listeners are not following you already, they definitely will start. I will be sure to add your links into the show notes so that it's easy to find. But thank you so much for creating the content that you're doing and also making sure that you keep food such a big part of our lives and part of the Indian community.
Thanks, Alicia.
We look forward to speaking to you again. But until our next episode, Shup sweet and aware. Lots of love.